Session and the final session of today, which is the first cellular session. And I'm Hamid Haddadi from Imperial College in London. Our first speaker is Ayun, who's a researcher at NEC Labs in Princeton. Before that, he did his PhD in Stony Brook University. Ayun generally works on mobile systems and wireless sensing. So over to you.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Hamid. I'm Ayun from NEC Labs. So I'll be presenting SkyRAN, which is a part of our ongoing efforts about using UAV networks to deploy LTE infrastructure on demand. So this is a joint work with my colleagues at NEC Labs, Eugene, Karthik, Amir, and Sampath. So when you need LTE infrastructure on demand, one of the key applications is if you can understand what happens like when you lose cellular connectivity. So this is a picture from Puerto Rico. People are not actually taking pictures, but they are trying to hunt for the cell signals because most of the cell sites in Puerto Rico, because of the Hurricane Maria, it was destroyed. Like 95% of the cell sites were destroyed. So people were desperate to reach out for cell phone signals when most of the communication infrastructure was compromised due to like these natural calamities. So, as many of you might know that a series of hurricanes swept past the US recently, causing a lot of infrastructure damage. Or for example, the forest fires happening in California that causes a lot of infrastructure damage. So, in many counties, it took several days to as long as a few weeks to get back the cellular connectivity. So, it is really necessary to have something which is up and running quickly. And one of the key solutions is to have this kind of LTE infrastructure in place as quickly as possible. So one of the fabulous efforts was done by Google's Loon project, and they actually had up and running internet connectivity by their flying balloons. And this was like a high altitude solution that covers about tens to hundreds of square kilometers, and they require a lot of resources and they last much longer. On the other hand, we have low altitude platforms, AT&T being one of them, and they have this low altitude flying cows, which they call cell on wings. They have a drone that is equipped with a LTE radio, like a base station, and that is tethered to the ground and provides internet connectivity on demand also. And there are other telecom providers like, for example, Verizon, which are also testing out fixed they have fixed wing aircrafts which provide LTE service on demand. So with these different kinds of initiatives happening across the globe, we find UAV networks have the flexibility to prove themselves very useful whenever there is no infrastructure, and quickly have the infrastructure whenever it is needed. So it's not only limited to locations where we have natural calamities or disasters, but also places where we need short-term on-demand connectivity. For example, large gatherings like stadiums and places like that, as well as places where emergency responders are in action. For example, in forest fire kind of situations, fast responders and emergency responders might go and the cellular connectivity might be compromised, and you can readily put up an LTE infrastructure there to help those guys communicate among each other. So to this end, we envision a system called Skylight. We have been working on that for quite some time. And this is a system where we have a control stations which is kind of remotely located somewhere around where we need to give the service. And we can have a fleet of UAVs like drones that can autonomously go around, control signals being sent from the control station, and each one of them can have a node B, like a base station that actually provides connectivity to the underlying UAVs on the ground. It could be like cell phones, UAVs, as well as vehicles of emergency responders and whatnot. And for the data, it could be either local, they could exchange data across among the drones, or it could have a satellite connectivity if you want to have connection to the internet. Or it could also go to the control station, and that which is connected, could be connected to a macro cell. So in this way, we can have an on-demand, flexible, low-altitude platform to give infrastructure on demand when it is not available. So this is the overall idea, and each Skylight instance in each one of the drones has basically three components. There is a RAN part, which takes care of the underlying radio access network connecting the different UAVs. There is a core network which actually sits on top of the UAV and provides the EPC for the LTE. And there is a backhaul component that interconnects the different drones together as well as to the base station to have some kind of internet connectivity or connection across the drones. And although this system was built keeping LTE in mind, SkyRAN and SkyHall, if you take out the core, is still applicable. This principle is still applicable if the network was running on a Wi-Fi instead of LTE. So the principles doesn't change much. So today, the focus of the talk would be SkyRAN because I've been talking about the access network mostly. And the problem we try to solve here is how do you optimize the connection across the UAVs from the UAV. So the primary problem we want to look at is we want to have good connectivity from the UAV to the different UAVs, right? And we need two things. One is such that all the UAVs are covered, we are not leaving out any UAV. And the second one is that we want all the UAVs to have good capacity in terms of throughput, for example. So that's what we call connectivity. So we need coverage as well as we need good capacity, which constitutes of a good connectivity. So I'll give a couple of examples so that you get the idea about what we are trying to do. So we want to position the UAV in 3D space. Let's say it's a search space. On the right hand side, it's just an abstract idea about where you need to probe. And let's say the UAV is here. So what happens is a lot of good UAVs get a good capacity, but there are some UAVs which are actually left out because the position of the UAV. So some of the UAVs lack coverage, right? So this is something that we can't consider because we don't actually give good connectivity to all the UAVs. Secondly, if we go, for example, to a different location, we now have a good coverage because now all the UAVs are actually covered, but some of the UAVs have poor capacity in terms of throughput, maybe because of shadowing. There could be like structures like buildings and trees and whatnot, which actually cause shadowing for depending on the position of the UAV. And if you go to still another place, right, the position could be flipped and you now have a different set of problem. The UAVs that were actually getting a good coverage earlier now gets poor coverage, poor capacity. And that is the reason this is not something that we can use. And similarly, for a large area, we need to probe a lot of locations, and most of it could turn out to be not very helpful in terms of connectivity. And after that, there could be a location which you might be able to fortunately find out and which could have all the properties that are desired for a good connectivity across the UAVs. So this could be an optimal UAV position, but not only that, there could be multiple positions which could satisfy the desired set of properties that we need. That depends a lot on the type of terrain that we are operating on and where the UAVs are distributed across and so on. So this is the basic idea in the paper that we are trying to solve. Now, just to give you some numbers why it is so important, given an area of 250 meter by 250 meter that we did some experiments on, we show a CDF on the top. This is a CDF of the average throughput across the UAVs, and the points being all the locations. We basically brute forced to all the locations the UAVs could fly to, and then calculated the average throughput per UAV. So if you see, the median is about 16 megabits per second, and the 95th percentile is approximately 27 to 28 megabits per second. That means, like, if you randomly place the UAV somewhere, you are going to get almost 10 Mbps average throughput less compared to the optimal position. So there is a lot of room for improvement in terms of how do you actually efficiently position the UAV such that you get optimal connectivity to all the different clients that are positioned on the ground. So just an example, the heat map shows an optimal connectivity position where the UAVs have a 30 Mbps. The poor one, the location that actually really gives a poor bandwidth, is just 3.7 Mbps. The details are there in the paper where we carried out extensive experiments by moving the drone at different possible locations. So analytically, what does it mean? So what's the complexity of the search? It's a 3D space. There are several components to it. First is, we are showing as a two-dimensional example earlier, that you need to position the UAV in a XY plane, but there's an altitude component to it also. That how high can you go? If you go too high, the path loss will be very high, resulting in a poor throughput. And if you are too low, there could be a lot of structures like that serve as obstacles to the UAV, as well as the path loss being very high. So you need to find out the right altitude. So it's a three-dimensional space that you need to search from. And not only that, the UVs could be anywhere on the ground. It's not just like one set of UVs, but it could be a set of UVs that could be anywhere within a fixed area, right? That adds the complexity of n square. So basically on top, if you have a three-dimensional space which is n cubed, and the UVs could be practically anywhere on the ground. So for every position of the UV, you can have an optimal position in this space. So n square multiplied by n cube. So this is a lot of such if you want to apply a brute force strategy. So we try to figure out what sort of heuristics work, and the problem that we try to solve in this paper is the following: how do you systematically search for the optimal operating point within a very short period of time? And these are the constraints. The short period of time comes because the UAV has limited battery. It can fly to about half an hour with one battery refilling. And so what we want to do is maximize the duration that the UAV offers optimal connectivity to the UVs, rather than searching for the location where it is supposed to work from. So I'll give you a high level idea about how SkyRAN works. So instead of going the way I showed you in the example, like going to different locations and trying out probing the UVs whether it's satisfactory or not, that's more of a brute force approach. We take a approach where we try to construct the radio environment map. Radio environment map is nothing but the distribution of the signal over space. So if you have a UV on the ground, how does the signal look like in the 3D space? So that is what we call the radio environment map. And so this is basically trying to estimate the channel, which is much more granular compared to if we measured, for example, latency or throughput. So that is the thing that we want to do. So if you have like 3 UVs, so we first construct the radio environment map. I'm going to tell you how we are doing it. Next, what we are trying to do is we aggregate these radio environment maps using some sort of an utility function. So for any location, you can actually look at the 3 maps and then aggregate those values according to a function of your choice. It could be min max SNR, it could be an average SNR, or it could be a median SNR, depending on what kind of utility function you want to implement in your system. And then we choose the location that basically maximizes the function. So that is the location of your choice where you can put the UAV in, right? So for estimating the REM, I'm going to get into the details. That is the major portion of the heuristics, that how do you estimate the REM without any information to start from. So it turns out that when you start looking to estimate the REM, you have to start from somewhere. You don't even know where the UVs are located. So you basically first localize the UVs. So at least you have some idea about where the signal strengths are high and where the signal strengths are low. So we customize the eNode B in order to get the received the reference signals and compute the time of flight for the LTE signal for a series of locations. Like TOF is basically the time of flight, and the drone forms a synthetic aperture by flying, and multiple snapshots of this time of flight helps us multilaterate the location of the different UVs that are connected in the net, like to the eNode B. So in this way, we can know the location of all the UVs that are present, and we can achieve a localization accuracy median accuracy about 5 to 7 meters, which could be granular enough for our purpose. Right? Because the signal strength does not change that much within 5 to 7 meters. So first we have an idea about where the UVs are located. Now the next thing we want to do is that what altitude we should operate in. So the altitude selection, what we do is that we move the UAV vertically up and then figure out at what location the LTE path loss is minimum. It's a real plot where we fly the UAV vertically up, and you see that initially when the drone was on the ground, due to the lot of obstacles and trees around, the LTE path loss is really high. And then when it goes up to a reasonable height, say 40 to 45 meters in the air, the LTE path loss is, it shows a local minima. And then the distance factor tries to dominate, and when you go really high up, the path loss is very high again. So this is the way we figure out an optimal altitude to operate in. And then we move on to the problem of figuring out the REM in the two-dimensional space. So how do you do it? Once you know the location of the UVs, and you don't have any terrain information, you just apply a simple path loss model at the location of the UVs. So something like a simple log normal model will do. So this is we instantiate the process by this way. And the next thing what we do is the aggregated map, we cluster the signal gradients. So the intuition behind this is that wherever you have complexity in the terrain, right? So that will in turn affect the gradient of the signal. If you have too many undulations, obstacles, the gradient of the signal will be too convoluted. And that basically helps us to figure out those are the more informative points where you need to send the drone and sample those points. So this is the next step we do. We figure out the locations with the high signal gradients and cluster them in 2D space. And then we connect them, connect the cluster heads by using a traveling salesman problem. We figure out the shortest path, and that is the way we connect those points and sample those points, and that adds into the radio environment map, and that makes the map better. And we repeat this process till a certain budget is reached. Like every time we launch the drone, we can have a certain budget, like 2 minutes or 3 minutes, that we can spend in order to figure out the optimal point. And we can repeat this process, the radio map gets better till a certain point when the sampling doesn't add any more value to the map, or you replenish you are done with your budget. So given that, I'll give an overall idea about how this works. So first we do the localization. We get the GPS from the drone, the LTE SRS data, compute the time of flight, and using multilateration figure out the location of the UVs. Next we consider the REM. How do we construct the REM? We find out the optimal altitude, we find out the optimal trajectory, and then update the REM. This is updation because some of the UVs you could have earlier data from, so you could have, you could cache some of the REMs from the historical information, and that you could update using the newer trajectories. And using this finalized REM, you can find out the optimal position of the drone where to operate from, and then you can start the LTE service. And while the LTE service is running, we monitor the performance of the UVs just to know if the UVs move around a lot, for example, then the optimal position of the UAV will change, and we need to trigger this entire process again. So we keep on monitoring the performance of all the UVs. If it is good enough, we don't do anything, and if it is poor, we actually trigger this entire SkyRAN process to do the localization, followed by updation of the REM, and then modifying the optimal position where the drone should be operational from. So this is the architecture of the SkyRAN system, and there are like lots of details within each component that you can look into the paper to understand it better. This is a snapshot of the actual SkyRAN drone in operation. It has an open air interface, it's an open source EPC, and the eNodeB SkyRAN, the SkyRAN eNodeB also uses the open air interface, and we use the USRP, which is a commercially available software defined radio, and we customize the eNodeB in order to get the LTE SRS information in real time, and then compute the time of flight. And we have an omnidirectional antenna to connect to the different UVs. On the right hand side, we show a snapshot of how the ground truth data is collected for a certain altitude. So for a certain altitude, we basically brute force across all the locations uniformly and figure out the throughput, the signal strength, and all the values such that we can compare it in our trace-driven simulation. I have a couple of results just to have an idea about what sort of numbers we are looking at. So I'm comparing the relative throughput with respect to the optimal throughput that we can get. So this is the region with 250 square meter cross 250 meter cross 250 meter square, and we compare against a baseline which is pretty common in this literature using uniform trajectory. Like you can just uniformly go around the location with a fixed speed and then compare it with the SkyRAN's performance for a fixed budget. So if you fly, for example, 200 meters, you get almost 60% of the optimal throughput. Now, based on your requirements, you can either stop then, or you can actually continue to make it more refined. If you, for example, run for a kilometer within that area, you can get close to like the optimal throughput, but it is diminishing returns. So you have that, you can do a trade-off how much you want to really make the optimal throughput to. The other one was, we consider 3 areas, rural and New York City, for example. Both are similar in size, 250 meters into 250 meters, but the New York City had a lot of terrain undulations, and that is the reason, even for the similar sized area, because of the complexity of the terrain, the amount of time that takes for reaching 90% of the optimal throughput is almost thrice in case of New York compared to the rural area. So this also shows that that not only the size of the terrain, but also the terrain's complexity has a significant impact on how quickly you can reach a desired throughput goal. So with this, I'll wrap up my talk. So some of the salient points is Skylight is the first of its kind system that provides LTE connectivity using untethered drones. Just mind that the AT&T drone that I showed you in the picture had a EPC that is on the ground, and the drone is actually tethered from the ground. SkyRAN adapts to changes in overall UV connections to maintain the connectivity, and it also, as I said, preserves the historical information, that is the RAMs that has been constructed earlier, such that it could speed up when new UVs come in, or UVs come in the same place as of earlier. And we can achieve 90% to 95% of the optimal throughput with moderate flight time budgets. So with this, I'll conclude my talk. Thank you.
Very good. We have time for a couple of questions. If you would like to approach the microphone and introduce yourself briefly.
Hi. Well, I'm Matteo from University of Helsinki. Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. I was wondering about the basically when you have this calibration phase. So basically, you adjust the altitude and you perform the estimation basically of the position of the UAV, right? This takes some time, and at the same time, your user equipment might move. So I was wondering, like, which is the interval of time that you need for your calibration, and if it can compete somehow, which is like the speed of the user equipment that you can support somehow.
It's a very nice question. So it depends on the granularity of the mobility that you are looking at. So the time that you take to really do this calibration phase and the localization and estimating the RAMs, we are talking about a couple of minutes to say 5 minutes or something like that, right? And we are looking into situations where all the people don't drastically move from a different location in the network to a completely different location in the network, such that the optimal point of the UAV changes. So we are not talking about one UAV that significantly impacts the optimal position. We are looking at the aggregate behavior of the network. So if one of the guys move, that is fine. So we are not expecting that within that short time scale, we will have a significant change in the network that is going to impact that.
So mostly we are considering pedestrians, let's say this way, basically static, or like they move very, very shortly somehow.
Right,
Okay.
and that is at par with the human mobility model also.
Okay. I have just a follow-up question, maybe it's a bit out of that, but like when you were mentioning the SkyHole component, basically the one that allows you to communicate with other drones. So since like you have the core network there, I suppose you are using either Wi-Fi or a satellite dish to communicate, basically like to get internet connectivity, or like to communicate with the base station.
Yes, so for internet connectivity, you can have a satellite radio that is separate, and also you can have a different kind of a Wi-Fi interface, for example, could be talking to the other drones. But SkyHole is not a part of this paper.
Yeah, sure.
Just to give the broad idea.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Please go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Abdullah. I was wondering where the part where you optimize the altitude of the drone, right? Are you assuming that the height would be independent of the XY coordinates? Because it might be that some height may work well for a certain coordinate, but another height might work well for a different coordinate.
Exactly. I think that is one of the heuristics that we have applied, and then we have found the results reasonably close. That whatever happens in that ballpark altitude, the XY point that we figure out is relatively closer and it is not going to impact the performance much. But by doing this, we are getting a lot of performance benefit in terms of how long you need to fly. Because otherwise, it basically is a reduction from n cube to n square.
Any other questions? Oh, in the meantime, I just had a question I myself. In the simulations, how many times, if ever, you got stuck in a local optimal rather than a global optimal? Because you're doing this height first, then did you have this into consideration at all, that you might get stuck in a local optimal rather than a global optimal?
So in our experience, look, these are like the data I was showing was like real data. So we did not see something that the path loss shows some non-monotonous behavior, like it comes down and then it goes up, the path loss at least. So we did not see those kind of situations in practical environments.
Very interesting. So I'm wondering what's in your UAV, just the standard sort of a base station, is that right? So it's just a sort of an off-the-shelf base station, right? And then you just sort of use the monitoring infrastructure built in the base station to understand the performance of the UAVs.
So are you talking about the eNode B that we are using?
Yes, yeah, eNode B.
So the eNode B uses open air interface, like eNode B open source code, and we actually customize the code because we need to get the real-time SRS data. So we actually had to modify the existing existing eNode B code, and it's a USRB.
I see. And this SRS information, how frequently is that sent?
So that you can change, like
okay.
how you want to sample.
This is from the UEs though, right? This is from the phone though, right?
This is from the phone.
But you can still change it.
You can upsample the SRS information just to figure out the time of flight.
Okay, thank you.
Please go ahead, approach the microphone and say your name and...
Hi, so I'm Mara from TU Darmstadt. A question, when you were doing your measurements, how much of channel variation you saw on the sky? Because so you have the path loss and okay, so basically you may need to change the altitude quite often, because if the channel changes you cannot remain at that altitude, right?
So there are two things, right? So one is we have observed, that is in the paper, we have a small section on that. So if you are moving, the channel characteristics change pretty rapidly because of like the shadowing.
Right.
But if you are static, the variance is much less. So we do that because that is the trajectory, that the thing you saw, it was, the drone was mobile and actually climbing up, and that we do only once to figure out the optimal altitude. But you get, like if you do a regression, for example, you know what kind of altitude it stabilizes at. But when you are stationary and giving the LTE service, the fluctuation in
okay, that was exactly my question. Yeah, so once you're static, the channel variation is
pretty much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's thank you one more time.